In the winter of 1834, before the sun had fully risen over the frozen treetops, a man was already crouched beside a stand of hazel saplings, a short knife in one hand and a coil of brass wire wound around the other wrist. He carried no firearm that morning. He didn't need one. What he carried was knowledge. And that year, knowledge was worth more than gunpowder. The woods around a trapper's camp were never just scenery to admire from a distance. They were a system of resources and signs that had to be read like a map only he knew how to interpret. The cold bit at his fingers, but his hands stayed steady, because trembling there meant missing a knot, and missing a knot meant walking back to camp empty-handed, across thousands of mornings like this one, scattered from New England's woods to the edges of still uncharted territory. Much of practical American survival was built that decade, not through heroic feats, but through patient repetition of a technical gesture refined over generations, setting a wooden trap able to do its work alone, while the man slept, ate, or moved to another stretch of forest. What few understood then, and few understand now, is that the real engine of survival in the wild was never the hunter's strength, but the precision of the mechanism he left behind. A firearm demanded constant presence and luck of encounter. A well-built trap worked in absence. It let one man multiply his own presence. Covering ground his body alone never could. Trapping in 1834 was never about overpowering the animal by force. It was about understanding its behavior so precisely that a branch and a thin wire could do what an armed man alone never could. Ingenuity replaced muscle, and that substitution decided who came home with food. The most widespread mechanism among country boys and men of the era was the twitch-up, the branch that springs up suddenly. A young elastic sapling, preferably hickory, about 5 or 6 feet long and roughly axe-handle thick, was chosen in open woods where rabbits or partridges passed. About 5 feet from its base, the trapper built a small circular pen of upright sticks, 8 to 10 inches across, with a single 6-inch opening. There, a firm wooden bow was set arching over the gap, holding the whole trigger system. The pen's job wasn't to physically contain the animal. It was to funnel its movement straight through the point where a wire noose waited, ready to close at the slightest touch. The delicate part came next. A stick cut to the bow's exact height, baited at the center. Apple slice, berry, or meat. Fitted so any pull on the bait shifted the whole system's balance. A second stick, flattened at one end, held the noose at the other. The fit between these two pieces was the soul of the mechanism. Too loose, and wind alone would trip it with no catch. Too tight, and the animal could tug the bait without springing anything. Finding that exact balance was a skill built only through repetition and failure. The hand learning almost blindly, the instant 2 pieces of wood were ready to release. Once set, the mechanism entered its most revealing phase. The wait. A trapper never stood guard beside his trap. That wasted time and betrayed his presence. But he couldn't stray too far either. A typical campaign meant walking a trap line in regular cycles, dawn and dusk. The windows when most small game moved actively. That rhythm was itself part of the mechanism. The finest twitch-up was worthless without the patience to let it work undisturbed, and the discipline to return at the right moment, not so early as to spook wary prey, not so late as to lose the catch to another predator. Material choice was never aesthetic. It was applied physics with whatever the woods offered. Hickory was favored for its elasticity, bending into a bow without splitting and snapping back with force when triggered. Where hickory was scarce, trappers learned to spot other woods with similar give. The guiding principle was always the same: seek flexibility without fragility. Brass wire was preferred over plant cord because it held its slipknot shape and resisted morning damp without swelling or rotting over a weeks-long campaign. When wire ran short, sinew or finely braided rawhide served instead, though they needed more upkeep. Every material answered a precise demand: tension, durability, moisture resistance, and the absence of any scent that might warn the animal before it ever reached the trap. And scent leads into the technique's variations, because not every twitch-up was built the same way. There was the simple bow version, ideal for rabbits and partridges in open woodland. The notched stake variant, more sensitive, suited to smaller, jumpier prey like rodents. And the double bow variant, reducing false triggers in windy terrain, but reserved for trappers who'd already mastered the basics. No variant was definitively superior. What existed was a repertoire of solutions, each answering a specific terrain, species, and season. Real mastery in 1834 meant knowing which variant to choose, not memorizing one formula and applying it everywhere. Bait followed the same adaptive logic: apple peel or wild carrot for rabbits, grain and berries for partridges. But bait alone rarely guaranteed success. What truly drew or repelled an animal was the scent surrounding it. And that's where beginners made their costliest mistake. Human scent on the hands, on handled wood, on freshly cut wire, acted as a silent alarm to any animal with a working nose. Experienced trappers handled materials in thick leather gloves, kept sweat off the wood, and rubbed dirt or green leaves on their hands before assembling a mechanism. This wasn't superstition. Animals that escaped a human-scented trap simply never returned to that spot, and sometimes taught others of their kind to avoid the area entirely. That point deserves more weight, because it cuts against the image of wild animals as purely instinctive and incapable of learning. Foxes were known to memorize spots where they'd escaped a trap before, rerouting to avoid repeating the mistake. Raccoons, naturally curious, learned to recognize a twitch-up pen's shape and skirted around it even when the bait looked irresistible. This forced trappers to vary not just trap locations through the season, but the pen's shape, the stick arrangement, the bait itself. A constant rotation to stay ahead of the sharper animals. Underestimating that practical intelligence was, and still is, one of the most common mistakes among those who treat hunting as brute repetition, rather than a quiet, shifting dialogue between two parallel kinds of learning. It was exactly this mistake that cost one trapper dearly, in a campaign remembered around a winter camp that decade. He'd set a line of 12 traps along a known fox trail, all identical in pen shape, bow height, and bait. The first days brought 3 easy catches, a promising start that left him overconfident. But by the 4th night, traps turned up untouched each morning. Bait eaten clean around the edges, no noose ever sprung, as though something were lifting the food without once brushing the trigger. Irritated, he made the mechanisms more sensitive, and the result was worse. Traps firing on their own in the wind, catching nothing, while the remaining foxes seemed to learn, within days, to recognize that exact pattern and avoid it altogether, rerouting along a path he wouldn't find for weeks. The fault wasn't in the mechanism. Construction stayed technically sound, tension well calibrated, not perfect. The fault was subtler. He'd repeated the same visual and scent pattern across all 12 points, with no variation, and kept handling the traps carelessly after his early success. The reversal this story reveals is this: the real challenge of 1834 trapping was never mastering one construction technique to perfection. It was mastering its constant variation, understanding that a trap's own success, repeated without adjustment, quickly became its greatest weakness. The animal learned as fast as the man, sometimes faster. and a trap that worked today could fail tomorrow. Not from a flawed build, but from a failure to read the behavior it had itself provoked. That same trapper, according to accounts passed among hunters in the region, corrected course over the following weeks in a way that became something of a legend told around later campfires. He began rebuilding each trap at a slightly different point every few days, alternating pen designs, switching bait between cured meat and scraps of dead fowl, and, above all, rubbing his hands with damp earth and cedar leaves before touching any part of the mechanism. Within a month, catches resumed steadily, this time without the defensive learning pattern that had paralyzed the line. The lesson wasn't about building a better twitch-up, he already knew how, but about learning to think the way the prey thought, anticipating not just its first encounter with the trap, but its second and third. The accumulated learning of an animal that was, in its own way, also watching and adapting. There's something in that correction worth slowing down for. The real difference between an average trapper and a successful one in 1834 was never just in the hands. It was in the eyes and ears, the ability to walk into a stretch of woods and notice, before setting a single trap, what the terrain itself revealed. A faintly worn path through the grass, fur snagged on low branches at the exact height of a fox's body, fresh droppings signaling recent feeding, the shape and depth of tracks in the mud, revealing species and pace, hunting or fleeing or simply passing through. These signs, invisible to hurried eyes, were the forest's real language, and no mechanism, however well built, could make up for the absence of that reading. It was this quiet observation, more than any manual skill, that decided whether a trap was set in the right place at all. If this kind of practical knowledge, built on patience, observation, and constant adjustment rather than force or haste, still resonates with something in you, it's worth following these reconstructions of American camp life further, because this is exactly the kind of knowledge, passed down generation after generation around campfires and trails, that risks being lost if no one takes the trouble to tell it precisely. And it's on this image that the scene closes, almost as it began. A cold dawn, the woods still dark, and a small pen of sticks, its hickory bow gently bent under tension, waiting in absolute silence. There's no visible urgency in that mechanism, only the stillness of something well calculated, ready to react the instant it's touched, capable of working alone, multiplying one man's hands across a trail he might not walk again before dusk. That is the true legacy of 1834. Not the romantic image of a lone hunter facing nature through sheer force, but that of a man who learned to think alongside the forest, and who left behind, hidden among the branches, a quiet proof of that learning.